A struggling artist, married a 5-year-old millionaire. 1 week later, her fate shocked the town. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. On a quiet Sunday morning, the town gathered in whispers outside the old stone church. The bells tolled slowly, echoing across the square, but instead of joy, the sound stirred disbelief. People leaned against the iron gates, clutching coats tighter against the wind, waiting for a glimpse of the bride. "She is just a gold digger," a woman muttered under her breath. "Imagine marrying a man older than her father. She must be desperate," another voice sneered. Inside the dressing room, Emma sat in front of a cracked mirror. Her hands shook as she adjusted the lace veil that never felt like hers. She was 26 years old, a struggling artist who had sold only a handful of paintings at the local market. Her mother's hospital bills had swallowed every dollar she earned. Debt collectors had already circled like vultures. This wedding, a contract signed in ink and sealed with humiliation, was her only way to save her mother's life. The man waiting at the altar was Harold Whitmore, a 75-year-old millionaire whose name carried weight across the state. Once a fierce real estate mogul, his empire now trembled under the grasping hands of greedy relatives who wanted him declared unfit. To silence them, Harold needed a wife, a legal partner, who could shield his fortune from being torn apart. Emma's sketchbook rested in her lap. The worn leather cover was smudged with paint and charcoal fingerprints. It was the only thing she had carried into this gilded cage. Her art was her soul, her last proof that she was not just the girl who married for money. The heavy oak door creaked open. A young assistant peeked in, whispering, "It is time." Emma inhaled sharply. The air tasted of dust and roses. She rose to her feet, clutching the bouquet as if it might anchor her to the ground. With every step toward the church aisle, the voices outside grew louder, sharper, like daggers of judgment thrown at her back. Harold stood stiffly at the altar in a tailored suit, silver hair combed back, his expression unreadable. He looked more like a statue than a groom. When his eyes met Emma's, there was no warmth, only calculation, as if this entire ceremony was a chess move in a long game of power and survival. The priest's voice droned on, but Emma barely heard the words. Her chest pounded with shame. She could feel the townspeople staring, their whispers clawing at her like smoke filling her lungs. Yet she repeated the vows, word by word, sealing a bond that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. When the rings were exchanged, Harold slid the gold band onto her finger with mechanical precision. His touch was cold, his hand trembling slightly with age. Applause was hesitant, scattered, tinged with mockery rather than blessing. The doors opened again, and the new bride and groom stepped into the daylight. The crowd parted, some raising phones to capture the scandalous sight. Emma lowered her eyes, gripping her sketchbook tighter under her arm, as though the little book could shield her from the cruelty of the world. The whispers chased her down the church steps. She sold herself. She will not last a week. This marriage is nothing but a deal. No. But what none of them knew was that within 1 week, this so-called fake marriage would change everything. Emma's fate, and the truth about Harold Whitmore, would shock the entire town in ways they never imagined. The wedding was over, but the silence inside the limousine was heavier than the crowd's whispers had been. Emma sat stiffly against the leather seat, bouquet wilting in her lap, sketchbook pressed against her chest. She could still feel the sting of the townspeople's judgment echoing in her ears. Across from her, Harold adjusted his cufflinks with the same detachment he had shown at the altar. He did not offer a word of comfort. For him, this was a transaction completed. For her, it was a sacrifice made. As the limousine rolled through the winding streets of the town, Emma's mind wandered back to the days that had led her here. Just 1 month earlier, she had been standing behind a booth at the Saturday market, her hands stained with paint, trying desperately to sell her small canvases. Her paintings, filled with color and life, rarely earned more than a few dollars. Most people passed by without even looking. She smiled at strangers, offered discounts, even gave pieces away in hopes someone would remember her name. But no one did. The little she earned vanished into hospital bills. Her mother lay in a sterile white room at St. Mary's Hospital, her body weak, her smile fading. The doctors spoke of treatments, medications, and procedures, but each word sounded like another mountain of debt. Emma had begged for more time, promising she would find a way. Every day she walked the cold corridors with her sketchbook tucked under her arm, sitting beside her mother's bed and sketching little birds, flowers, and stars to make her smile. Debt collectors did not care about smiles or art. They called every evening, their voices sharp, their demands cruel. Emma sold her easel, her paints, even the only gold locket her late father had left behind. Yet the bills kept arriving, thicker and harsher with every passing week. She had cried alone at night, pages of her sketchbook blurred by tears. Then came Harold Whitmore. Their worlds should never have collided. He was 75 years old, a man of enormous wealth and power. His name was carved into office towers and engraved on brass plaques in the city. But behind the polished image was a storm. Harold's health was failing. His relatives circled him like vultures, eager to declare him incompetent, to snatch away the empire he had built from the ground up. He needed someone to stand beside him, someone who could make his position untouchable. It was his attorney who approached Emma first, a cold man in a black suit who found her at the market and slid a card across her table. Emma had laughed bitterly when he explained the proposal. A contract marriage. She thought it a cruel joke, the kind of thing whispered about in novels but never real life. Yet when she returned home that night and stared at the stack of unpaid bills, she realized it was no joke at all. It was an escape hatch in a burning room. The agreement was simple, on paper at least. Emma would become Harold's wife in the eyes of the law, a public shield against his enemies. In return, Harold would cover her mother's hospital costs in full, with an additional allowance to keep collectors at bay. The contract was clear. Theirs would never be a marriage of love. No expectations, no intimacy, only appearances. Emma had signed with trembling hands. She told herself it was temporary, that she was saving her mother, not selling her soul. But as the limousine pulled up to the wrought iron gates of Whitmore Estate, and the crowd of photographers shouted her name with venom on their tongues, Emma knew the price was heavier than ink on paper. The mansion loomed before her, towering with marble columns and endless windows that reflected the setting. Sunday, it was a palace built on wealth she could not comprehend, and yet it felt colder than any empty apartment she had ever lived in. Harold stepped out first, dignified, nodding stiffly at the flashing cameras. Then he extended a hand to her, not with tenderness, but with formality, as though guiding a business partner into a boardroom. Emma placed her hand in his, her sketchbook still pressed against her side. She forced herself to breathe as they crossed the threshold into a world where nothing would ever be simple again. Deep down, she wondered if the girl with paint on her fingers and hope in her chest was already gone, replaced by a stranger in a lace dress and a gold band. And so began her life as Mrs. Whitmore, the wife of a millionaire, bound not by love, but by necessity. What Emma did not know was that the contract she had signed would soon unravel, exposing secrets neither she nor Harold had prepared to face. The first night inside Whitmore Estate felt less like a beginning and more like a sentence. The grand foyer glowed with chandeliers. The marble floor gleamed as though polished for royalty, yet Emma's footsteps echoed with loneliness. A butler in a crisp uniform bowed as Harold entered, then handed over a thick envelope sealed in wax. It was the contract, the rules of this union written in legal terms so precise that even a breath out of line might count as betrayal. Harold glanced at Emma and said with the same calmness he had at the altar, "Read it. Know it. Abide by it." His voice was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply transactional. Emma carried the envelope to her room. Yes, her room, for the contract was clear. They would not share one. The bedroom prepared for her was lavish, larger than the apartment she had grown up in, with silk curtains and a bed that seemed too soft to hold her restless body. She sat at the desk, opened the envelope, and read by the glow of a golden lamp. The pages detailed every expectation. She was to attend social functions as Harold's wife, smile for the cameras, and sit beside him during charity galas. She was to dine with him at the long oak table when requested. There would be no obligations beyond appearances, and there was a clause written in cold type that struck her heart like ice. No expectation of affection or intimacy. Emma lowered the paper, her eyes drifting to her sketchbook. It lay on the desk like a fragile piece of her real self, contrasting sharply against the sterile lines of the contract. She traced the edge of the cover, telling herself this was just survival. Yet as she looked around the room, she wondered if she had traded her freedom for a gilded prison. Dinner that evening confirmed her fears. The table stretched longer than any she had ever seen, enough to seat 20 guests, yet only 2 places were set. Harold sat at the head, his posture rigid, his silver hair catching the chandelier light. Emma sat to his right, an entire stretch of polished wood between them. Servants moved quietly, setting down dishes of roasted lamb, steamed vegetables, and crystal glasses filled with wine. Neither spoke for several minutes. The clinking of silverware echoed like tiny hammers in her ears. Finally, Harold cleared his throat. "You understand your role?" Emma swallowed and nodded. "Yes, I am to be your wife in public, nothing more." "Good." His gaze lingered on her for a brief moment, unreadable, then shifted back to his plate. The silence resumed, heavier than before. Emma forced down each bite, the flavors lost beneath the weight of her shame. Across from her, Harold ate with mechanical precision, every movement measured, every gesture controlled. It was as though they were actors trapped in a play neither of them wished to perform. After dinner, Emma retreated to her room. She sat on the floor with her sketchbook, flipping to a blank page. Her pencil moved hesitantly at first, then faster, sketching the long table, the distant figure of Harold at its far end. But she did not draw him as cold or cruel. Instead, her hand captured the loneliness she had seen flicker in his eyes when he thought she was not watching. The next morning, the contract demanded its first test. Harold's attorney arrived to escort them to a press conference. Outside the estate gates, reporters waited with microphones and cameras ready. Harold stepped forward, his hand steady on Emma's arm, guiding her into the flashing storm. Questions flew like arrows. Why marry her? Was this about inheritance? How long will it last? Emma forced herself to smile, her cheeks aching, her fingers clenching the sketchbook hidden inside her purse. She felt the weight of 1,000 judgments pressing down, but she remembered her mother's fragile smile in that hospital bed. For her, Emma would endure. As the cameras snapped and the crowd murmured, Harold whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Stand tall. This is what you agreed to." Emma lifted her chin, her eyes burning but steady. She walked beside him, each step deeper into a marriage bound not by love, but by paper, law, and necessity. What she did not yet know was that behind the rigid contract and cold words, cracks were beginning to form. Cracks that would reveal truths about Harold, and about herself, that no contract could ever contain. The weeks that followed turned Emma's life into a theater stage where every step was scrutinized. The tabloids filled their pages with photographs of her walking beside Harold, her hand tucked lightly into his arm. Headlines screamed that she was a fortune hunter, that she had trapped an old man in his final days. At the market where she once sold paintings, familiar faces turned away as if she carried shame like a disease. Inside the mansion, the walls themselves seemed to whisper doubt. Servants avoided eye contact. Every dinner was another performance, 2 actors at a long table, playing roles for an invisible audience. Yet Emma felt the strain most deeply when Harold's relatives began to circle. They came in waves, dressed in expensive suits and jeweled dresses, pretending to offer congratulations but dripping with disdain. One afternoon, his nephew Charles cornered her in the hallway, his smile sharp as glass. "You know, Emma," he said, his voice low but poisonous, "people like you never last. My uncle is a stubborn man, but he is not immortal. When he is gone, you will be nothing but a pretty footnote in his obituary, so enjoy the silk sheets while you can." Huh. Emma stood frozen, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but she swallowed the words. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked past him, refusing to let his cruelty see her bleed. Later that evening, Harold noticed her silence at dinner. He asked nothing, but his eyes flickered, a brief flash of something that almost resembled concern. For a moment, Emma wondered if the cold marble of his demeanor hid a man who understood loneliness better than anyone. The real storm came when photographs of her alone in the garden appeared in the papers. A reporter claimed she was sneaking meetings with a younger man, though the image clearly showed nothing more than her sitting under the oak tree with her sketchbook. Still, the damage was done. Whispers grew louder, sharper, and soon the entire town painted her as unfaithful before she had even spoken a word. The pressure built until one evening Harold summoned her into the study. The room smelled of old books and polished wood. He stood by the fireplace, the flames casting shadows across his face. "Do you have something to confess?" he asked, his voice heavy. Emma's heart pounded. "Confess? About what?" "The papers," he said, holding up the tabloid, the photograph glaring back in black and white. "They say you are already betraying this arrangement." Emma stepped forward, anger flooding her veins. "That is a lie. I have done nothing wrong. I sit in the garden because it is the only place I feel like myself. The only place I can breathe. If that is a crime, then so be it." For the first time since their marriage began, her voice cracked through the silence of the mansion. Harold stared at her, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He set it down without a word. The tension between them hung heavy, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. That night, Emma returned to her room and poured her fury into her sketchbook. She drew Harold not as the world saw him, a titan of wealth, a man of stone, but as she saw him in that brief flicker of vulnerability by the fire. His eyes haunted, his shoulders bowed under a weight invisible to others. When dawn came, Emma felt both defeated and strangely defiant. The world could call her a fortune hunter, a liar, a fraud. But in her sketches, she was still Emma, the artist, the daughter fighting for her mother. What she did not realize was that Harold, though silent, had lingered at her door that night. Hearing the scratch of pencil against paper, sensing the storm of her soul, and for the first time, he wondered if this young woman, whom everyone dismissed as a fraud, might be the only honest soul left in his gilded world. It happened late one night, just as the rain began to lash against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. Emma was in her room, curled on the floor with her sketchbook, when she heard the sudden crash of glass from down the hall. She rushed into the corridor and found Harold leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale, his breath ragged. "Harold!" she cried, dropping her sketchbook and running to him. His hand clutched at his chest. "The medicine," he whispered hoarsely, pointing weakly toward his study. Emma's heart pounded as she bolted into the study, searching frantically until she found the bottle of prescribed pills. Her hands trembled as she poured water into a glass and carried it back to him. She guided the pills to his mouth, steadied the glass at his lips, and held him upright until the tension in his chest began to ease. When his breathing slowed, Harold's eyes fluttered open. For a moment he simply stared at her, as though trying to reconcile the image of this young woman with the bitter accusations his relatives had poured into his ears. "You stayed," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Of course I stayed," Emma replied, her voice shaking. "What kind of person would walk away?" Something in his expression softened, just for a heartbeat. He let her help him to the armchair, near the fire. As the storm raged outside, Emma fetched a blanket and draped it over his shoulders. She poured herself into caring for him, not because the contract demanded it, but because her heart refused to do otherwise. When Harold drifted into sleep, Emma returned to her sketchbook. She sketched the scene before her, the firelight glowing on his worn features, the deep lines etched by years of battles both in business and in life. But she also captured the flicker of vulnerability she had seen when he thought no one was looking. The following morning, Harold awoke to find that sketch resting on the side table. He picked it up with trembling hands. For the first time in years, he did not see himself as a symbol of power or wealth, but as a man who was simply tired, human, and mortal. At breakfast, his eyes lingered on Emma longer than usual. She noticed, but said nothing, too cautious to believe in any shift. Yet the air between them had changed. The silence at the long table no longer felt like a prison, but like a space waiting to be filled. Later that week, Harold accompanied Emma into the garden. He watched quietly as she sketched the roses climbing the trellis. When a breeze scattered her pages, Harold bent slowly, painfully, to retrieve them. He studied her drawings with a kind of reverence, then handed them back without a word. But in that small act, Emma sensed something she had never felt from him before: respect. The mansion, once a place of cold marble and distant shadows, began to feel slightly different. There was still suspicion in the eyes of his relatives, still venom in the headlines, but within those walls Emma found flickers of warmth she had never expected. For the first time, she wondered if beneath the contract, beyond the whispers, there might be something real growing between them, something no paper could define. What neither of them knew was that this fragile shift would soon be tested by forces far more dangerous than gossip. Forces determined to tear apart the strange bond that was beginning to form. The calm that followed their fragile moment of connection did not last long. Within days, Harold's relatives struck back with a cruelty that stunned even Emma. It began with a series of letters delivered by courier, each one filled with accusations. They claimed Emma was siphoning money from Harold's accounts, that she had persuaded him to transfer assets into her name. The words were venomous, yet carefully designed to spark scandal. Soon, the whispers outside the estate became roars. Reporters gathered at the gates from dawn until midnight, their voices sharp as they demanded answers. Headlines painted Emma as a thief who had tricked a vulnerable old man into marriage for wealth. Neighbors in town crossed the street to avoid her. Some even spat in her direction when she ventured out, as though she carried a curse. Inside the estate, the tension thickened. Harold's attorney advised him to consider separation to protect his image. At dinner, the long oak table that had once begun to feel almost bearable returned to being a battlefield of silence. Emma forced down her food while Harold sat rigid, the accusations hanging heavy between them. One evening, Emma could no longer bear the weight. She pushed back her chair, her voice trembling but strong. "I have stolen nothing. Every dollar you spend on me goes to my mother's treatment. I have nothing else. If they believe I am a thief, then let them prove it. I will not be your scapegoat." Harold's eyes met hers across the table. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice low and steady, he replied, "They want to see you broken. Do not give them that satisfaction." "No." But even as he spoke, Emma could see the shadow of doubt flicker across his face. It cut her deeper than the words of his relatives ever could. She left the table with tears stinging her eyes, retreating to her room where she sketched until her hands ached. She drew herself standing at the estate gates, faceless crowds jeering from the outside. Her figure small but unbending. The attacks did not stop. A week later, Harold's nephew Charles confronted her at a charity gala. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and champagne, but his words dripped poison. "It is only a matter of time, Emma. When he dies, you will have nothing. We will make sure of it." Emma's face flushed, but she stood tall, refusing to let him see her falter. She remembered Harold's words, "Do not give them the satisfaction." Still, the storm outside grew louder. Tabloids published photographs of her entering St. Mary's Hospital, twisting the story into claims that she was funneling money into secret accounts. Every headline was another knife, every whisper another stone cast at her character. At night, Emma found Harold in the study more often, staring into the fire with a weariness that seemed to carve deeper lines into his face. One night, she dared to ask, "Do you believe them?" He looked up slowly, his eyes heavy. "I do not know what to believe anymore, but I know what I see, and what I see is a woman who has not run away, even when the entire world turned against her." The words brought her no comfort. If anything, they deepened her ache. She wanted his trust completely, not his half-hearted defense. The pressure mounted until Emma felt as though she were suffocating. She thought of her mother in that hospital bed, unaware of the vicious battle consuming her daughter's life. Emma whispered to herself that she would endure, that the truth would prevail. But deep down, she feared the tide was too strong to fight. What she could not see was that Harold, though distant and torn, was beginning to realize the same family he had trusted with his empire was capable of destroying the only honest person left in his world. And soon, he would be forced to choose between blood and truth. The breaking point came on a gray morning when the estate gates were surrounded by reporters demanding answers. They shouted Emma's name, called her a thief, and waved papers filled with accusations. Harold stood at the window of his study, his hand trembling as he clutched the curtain. He had been silent too long, watching his wife endure slander that was never hers to bear. That afternoon, he summoned his attorney and ordered a press conference. Emma, pale but resolute, stood beside him as they entered the hall packed with flashing cameras and skeptical eyes. The room buzzed with anticipation, the journalists hungry for blood. Harold took the podium, his voice steady though his age showed in every breath. "You have all accused my wife of crimes she did not commit. Today, I will tell you the truth." The crowd hushed instantly. Emma felt her knees weaken, but she stood tall, clutching her sketchbook against her chest like a shield. "I married Emma," Harold continued, "not because she sought wealth, but because I sought survival. My own family plotted to strip me of my company, my dignity, and my freedom. I needed someone strong enough to stand with me against their greed. And she, this woman you call a fortune hunter, has given me nothing but loyalty." Gasps rippled through the room. Cameras clicked furiously. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was one of Emma's sketches, the one she had drawn the night he nearly collapsed. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is how she sees me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Not as a tycoon, not as a man with wealth, but as a human being. She has reminded me that I am more than my fortune. And I will not allow her to be destroyed for standing by me." Emma's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. The journalists who had moments ago been sharpening their knives now looked shaken, uncertain. The whispers in the crowd shifted tone, disbelief giving way to awe. Harold stepped back from the podium, his hand brushing against Emma's for the briefest moment. The cameras caught it, the small gesture of solidarity that said more than any speech ever could. For the first time since their wedding, Emma felt the weight of the world lift slightly from her shoulders. Harold had chosen to reveal the truth, and with it, he had chosen her. What none of them realized yet was that this revelation would ignite a war inside the Whitmore family. A war that would either destroy them both or bind them together forever. The fallout from Harold's revelation was swift and merciless. Within hours, his relatives stormed into the estate, their polished shoes clicking like weapons on the marble floors. Charles was at the front, his face twisted with rage. "You have lost your mind, uncle," he spat. "You let that woman manipulate you into humiliating us all in public. Do you not see? She is bleeding you dry." Harold sat in the study, Emma beside him, her hand steady on the sketchbook in her lap. For once, he did not flinch beneath their fury. Instead, he gestured calmly to his attorney, who stepped forward with a folder thick with documents. "These," Harold said, his voice firm, "are records of every transaction made in this house since Emma became my wife. Not 1 cent has gone into her account. Not $1 has been stolen. But what these records do show is evidence of embezzlement carried out by my own blood." The attorney laid the papers on the desk. Charles's face drained of color. Gasps filled the room as signatures and hidden transfers were exposed for all to see. The empire they had plotted to steal had been carefully traced back to their own greed. Emma sat in silence, her heart racing as justice unfolded before her eyes. For weeks she had carried the weight of accusations that branded her a thief. Now the truth was undeniable. She was innocent. The ones who had tormented her were the true criminals. "You wanted me declared incompetent," Harold continued, his tone sharper now. "You wanted to tear apart what I built. But it is over. The board knows the truth. The law will know it soon as well." Charles sputtered, his fists clenched, but there was no ground left to stand on. One by one, the others retreated, their heads bowed, their power crumbling beneath the weight of evidence. When the last of them had gone, the house seemed to exhale. The storm that had rattled its walls for weeks had broken at last. Emma turned to Harold, searching his face. For the first time, she saw not just the steely businessman, but the man who had chosen to fight for her when it mattered most. "You defended me," she whispered. Harold looked at her, his eyes heavy but clear. "No, you defended me first. You stayed when no one else would. This is only justice catching up." Tears slipped down Emma's cheeks, not of sorrow, but of release. The whispers outside the gates would not vanish overnight, but the truth had been spoken, and the chains of accusation shattered. The mansion, once filled with suspicion and shadows, now felt like a place where light could enter again. And for Emma, it was the first time she believed that perhaps this marriage, born of necessity and paper, might yet transform into something real. The days after the confrontation passed in an unfamiliar quiet. For the first time since Emma entered Whitmore Estate, the air no longer carried the weight of suspicion. The The relatives who had mocked and slandered her were silenced, their schemes exposed. Yet the greatest shift was not in the halls of the mansion, but in Harold himself. One evening, Emma found him waiting in the drawing room. The fire cast a soft glow over his features, and in his hand he held a leather folder. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and extended it toward her. "What is this?" she asked, her voice cautious. Harold's eyes met hers. "The contract. The one that bound you to me, in ink and obligation." Emma hesitated, then opened the folder. The familiar pages stared back at her, the cold clauses that had defined their strange union. But across the front page, Harold had drawn a firm line, his signature scrawled beneath the words, "Null and void." Emma's breath caught. "You ended it?" "Yes," he said simply. "Because I no longer need a wife in name only. I need a partner. Someone who sees me as more than a fortune or a failing body. Someone who already proved her loyalty long before I deserved it." Her eyes blurred with tears. For so long, she had been braced for betrayal, for rejection, for the cold reminder that their marriage was nothing but paper. But here he was, offering something no contract could ever promise. A choice, freely made. Harold reached into his coat and pulled out her sketchbook, worn from use, its edges smudged with charcoal. He placed it gently into her hands. "This is how you kept me alive," he said quietly. "Not the lawyers, not the money. You, your art, your kindness, your refusal to leave." Emma clutched the book to her chest, her voice trembling. "And what about the world outside these walls? They will never understand." "Then, let them misunderstand," Harold replied, his voice steady. "I built an empire by defying expectations. I will build whatever time I have left with you the same way. Not for appearances, not for survival, but for love." The words hung in the air, fragile and powerful. Emma felt the final weight she carried fall from her shoulders. She set her sketchbook on the table, opened to a blank page, and picked up her pencil. Her hand moved slowly at first, then with surer strokes. She drew not the lonely figure she once saw at the end of a long oak table, but two people side by side, the space between them filled with warmth instead of distance. When she finished, she slid the sketch across to Harold. He studied it with glistening eyes, then took her hand in his. For the first time, there was no contract between them, no performance, no masks. Only a man and a woman choosing each other in truth. And as the fire burned low, Emma realized that her fate was no longer something to fear or to endure. It was something she would create, stroke by stroke, with the man who had once been a stranger but had become her home.